The galaxy had been at war for many years, and every race feared the enemy that came from the dark edges of space, an ancient force that destroyed worlds without mercy, leaving nothing but silence behind. And so the races of the stars made an alliance, a promise to fight together, so no world would fall alone. And in that alliance, humanity was one of the youngest, but also one of the most determined. Because Earth had suffered many wars before, and they believed unity was the only way to survive this new threat. But when the enemy came closer and closer, tearing through defenses, the other races began to panic, their fleets breaking apart, their leaders arguing in secret councils, and whispers spread across the stars that Earth would be the shield, Earth would be the sacrifice, and humanity did not know that the allies they trusted were already preparing to abandon them, waiting for the right moment to flee and leave humans behind. The night of betrayal came silently. No warning, no farewell, only silence across the channels where once voices of allies spoke with promise. And when human commanders looked for support, they found empty space, the great fleets of the galaxy already gone, their stars fading into the distance as they retreated, leaving Earth's small navy standing alone before the storm. In every human command room, shock spread like fire, voices rising, questions filling the air. Why are they gone? Why are they left? And the answer came slowly, painfully, as the truth became clear. They never believed humanity could win. They wanted humans to buy them time with blood. And when the enemy finished Earth, maybe they hoped the darkness would be weak enough for them to survive. But humanity understood one thing in that moment. They were alone, truly and completely abandoned. The enemy fleet appeared like a sea of shadows, dark ships blotting out the stars, their engines glowing red like the eyes of predators, and the humans could feel the weight of fear pressing on their chests, because no one expected them to survive, not the galaxy, not even some of their own leaders. And still the human fleets did not run. They formed their lines around Earth, their voices steady, their hands gripping controls, their hearts burning with a strange fire that comes only when there is no hope left but the will to fight. Across Earth, people watched the skies, children holding their parents' hands, soldiers preparing for battles they knew could be their last. And in that silence before the first shot, humanity felt the betrayal deeper than the fear. They remembered the promises of unity, the oaths of friendship, the words of trust, and now all of it was gone, replaced by cold emptiness. Yet in that emptiness, something else was born, something fierce and unbroken. A whisper passed between soldiers and civilians, between pilots and captains, between leaders and the ordinary people of Earth. The whisper was simple but powerful. We stand alone. The words spread like lightning, whispered in the bunkers, repeated in the command ships, carried in the transmissions across the globe. And suddenly humanity no longer felt abandoned. They felt challenged, as if the galaxy itself had turned against them to see what they were truly made of, and if death was to come, then they would meet it with fire. The first attack struck fast, enemy ships pouring weapons of destruction, burning through Earth's outer defenses, human ships exploding in bursts of flame. But even in chaos, the humans fought back, their smaller ships darting between giants, their weapons tearing into enemy hulls, and for every human vessel lost, an enemy ship burned beside it. And across the galaxy, the races who had abandoned them watched in silence, expecting Earth to fall in hours. But as the battles raged and the smoke covered the stars, something began to change. Humanity was not breaking. They were fighting harder, fiercer, louder, as if the betrayal itself had given them a strength no one had ever seen before. And while the galaxy whispered that Earth was doomed, humanity whispered something far greater into the void of space. A promise not only to the enemy, but to all who had abandoned them. We stand alone, and we will not fall. The council chamber on Earth was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that comes after a great wound. And every leader of humanity sat there knowing the truth. No allies would return, no help would come, and the galaxy had already marked them for death. Yet in that silence there was no surrender. Instead, there was fire, a fire burning in the eyes of generals, scientists, captains, and even the youngest voices among them. And though fear filled the air, it was not stronger than resolve. Because they all knew if humanity was to fall, it would not be on its knees, but standing tall. And so they began a plan. Outside, the people of Earth had already started whispering the words that would shape their destiny. We stand alone. And those words spread faster than any command. They became a vow, a prayer, and a weapon, repeated by soldiers before battle, spoken by parents to their children, carried in every broadcast. And when soldiers boarded their ships, they carried that whisper in their hearts, not as despair, but as defiance. The first human counterattack was born from this whisper, a desperate plan that seemed impossible on paper, but humanity had never lived by rules of possibility. They had always survived by daring the impossible. And so small fleets of human ships left the safety of orbit, hiding among asteroids, disguising their signals, and striking at enemy supply lines. The enemy expected them to defend Earth in fear. But instead, humanity hunted them in the shadows, proving that even surrounded they could still bite. Across the stars, reports began to spread, human ships appearing and vanishing like ghosts, convoys destroyed, warships crippled. And though the galaxy had abandoned Earth, they could not ignore the stories that reached them. Whispers that humanity was not lying down to die. Whispers that maybe Earth was different. Whispers that the youngest race had something the older ones had long forgotten: the will to fight without hope. In the war rooms of the enemy, commanders grew restless. Their fleets had crushed dozens of civilizations before, and never once had resistance lasted so long. Yet these humans, with their fragile ships and smaller numbers, fought as if they could not see defeat, as if every battle was a chance to write a legend. And in that restless confusion, humanity found its strength. On Earth, engineers worked day and night, building weapons from scraps, turning old technology into new tools of war. Children delivered supplies. Farmers gave their harvest for soldiers, and no one remained untouched, because when you stand alone, everyone becomes a soldier in their own way. And soon humanity was not just fighting with fleets, they were fighting with spirit, and that spirit was louder than fear. The galaxy watched with uneasy eyes. Leaders who once voted to abandon Earth now listened in secret to transmissions of human defiance. And though they told themselves it was foolish, something in them stirred, a memory of what courage looked like. But still none moved to help, none dared, for they believed humanity would fall soon, and they did not want to share in the punishment. But humanity was no longer fighting for survival alone. They were fighting for dignity, for pride, for the right to exist without kneeling, and their leaders reminded them every day that even if the end came, they must carve such a scar into the enemy that the galaxy would remember Earth forever. And so the whisper grew louder. It became a roar hidden in quiet voices, a roar that no one could hear but everyone could feel. We stand alone, we fight alone, and still we fight. And when the next wave of enemy ships arrived, larger and deadlier than before, the humans did not flinch. They moved with precision, striking like wolves among giants. And though many fell, their courage did not fall. And in the silence after the battle, one truth became clear: the galaxy had left them to die. But humanity had already chosen. They would not die quietly. They would not die forgotten. They would not die kneeling. They would fight, alone if they must, but fight until the stars themselves burned out. The enemy believed they had cornered humanity, their fleets surrounding Earth like predators circling prey. But what they did not understand was that prey can also bite, and when prey is desperate, it becomes dangerous. And so humanity decided to strike first, not with overwhelming power, for they had little compared to the enemy, but with speed, intelligence, and the courage to fight where no one else dared. And so small human fleets broke away from Earth's orbit, slipping into the dark void, where asteroids drifted silently and nebula clouds hid the glow of engines. The enemy thought humans were hiding in fear, but in truth they were hunting, and the first strike came without warning. An enemy convoy carrying supplies for the massive armada suddenly vanished in a storm of fire. Human ships darting out from the shadows, weapons tearing into hulls, and before reinforcements arrived, they disappeared again into the dark, leaving only wreckage and silence. Across Earth, the news spread like wildfire. Humanity had not only survived, but had struck back, and in homes, shelters, and war rooms, people repeated the whisper with pride, "We stand alone, and we strike back." And the enemy, who once laughed at the thought of fragile humans resisting, now grew restless, for every time they pushed forward, another convoy burned, another ship was ambushed, and the humans seemed to know where to strike, as if they could read the enemy's movements before they happened. This was not luck. This was human will combined with strategy, for the captains who led these raids were men and women who refused to bow, and their tactics were born from Earth's long history of fighting against impossible odds. Guerrilla warfare, deception, sacrifice, and courage. And soon the enemy realized they were not fighting an army in the open. They were fighting ghosts in the shadows. One captain, known among his crew simply as Hale, became a symbol of this new war. His small destroyer slipping past blockades, striking enemy cruisers, then vanishing in asteroid belts where massive ships could not follow, and his name began to spread in whispers among human fleets, and even in fear-filled enemy reports, as a phantom who could not be caught, and Hale's words to his crew became legend. "We fight not to live, but to show them we cannot be killed." Each raid carried a heavy cost, ships destroyed, brave men and women lost. Yet every time the humans returned with scars, their spirit grew sharper, and the enemy began to hesitate, their commanders questioning why so many resources were being lost to a race that was supposed to die quickly. And in that hesitation, humanity found hope, not victory yet, but the beginning of something greater. On Earth, the leaders knew these raids were not enough to win the war, but they were enough to prove one truth: humanity could not be broken easily, and that truth spread beyond Earth, reaching the ears of the very races who had abandoned them. And though those races did not speak openly, they listened in silence, secretly amazed that humanity still stood. In the halls of those alien councils, whispers began to rise. Maybe humanity would last longer. Maybe they were not like the others, but still fear chained them, and no aid came. Yet even their silent curiosity was a victory, for humanity had already changed the story. They were no longer victims waiting to fall. They were fighters who refused to kneel. The enemy responded with fury, sending larger patrols, deploying traps, and chasing every human shadow. But the more they hunted, the more the humans adapted, turning desperation into innovation, building decoys, using old freighters as hidden weapons, and striking not where the enemy was strongest, but where they were blind. And soon the war was no longer only about survival. It was about pride, and even as losses mounted, the whisper grew louder. "We stand alone, we strike back, we are not prey." And in the void of space, where the wreckage of battles drifted like silent graves, the galaxy itself seemed to listen, because never before had a race so young, so fragile, fought with such fire against an enemy that devoured empires, and never before had the word alone sounded so powerful. For in the darkness of betrayal, humanity was not weak. They were rising, and their first strikes were only the beginning. The victories of the first strikes filled humanity with pride, but every victory carried a terrible cost. For while the enemy bled, humanity bled more, and the price of standing alone was written in fire across the skies of Earth, and in the endless black of space, where broken ships drifted silently like tombstones. And every family on Earth felt the cost as names of the fallen grew longer each day. Sons and daughters who never returned. Fathers who gave their last breath. Mothers who vanished into the void. And still humanity refused to bend. But even the strongest spirit cannot hide the pain. And the pain was everywhere. In the empty homes, in the burning cities, in the cries of children who asked why the stars hated them so much. And no leader could answer because the truth was heavy. The galaxy had abandoned them, and now humanity was paying the price for that betrayal. One young captain named Arden carried this weight more than most. His ship had been one of the first to strike back, and though his raids had destroyed enemy convoys and inspired others, he had lost nearly all his crew in the process. Friends he had known since training, voices that once filled the ship with laughter now silenced forever. And yet he kept fighting because he believed if he stopped, then their sacrifice would mean nothing. And in his grief, he whispered the same words to himself. "Every day, we stand alone, and his whisper gave him strength, but it also reminded him of a loneliness that now defined humanity's place in the galaxy. On Earth, the situation was dire. Whole cities reduced to rubble from orbital bombardments, fields burned, oceans poisoned by falling wreckage. Yet the people did not abandon their spirit. Instead, they rebuilt even in the middle of fire, digging shelters under the ruins, planting food in the cracks of destroyed streets, sharing what little they had sown. No one starved, because when no one else stands with you, you must stand for each other. And that became humanity's greatest strength. The enemy thought destruction would break the humans, but every attack seemed to forge them stronger. Every loss turned into fuel for vengeance. And soon the enemy commanders began to realize that crushing Earth was not as simple as they had believed. For each battle they won only created new heroes among the humans. New names whispered in the dark as symbols of defiance, and one by one these names became legends. Yet the cost continued to rise, and the burden of loss was heavy. Soldiers boarded ships knowing they might never return. Parents sent their children into bunkers knowing they might never see daylight again. And even as humanity roared with courage, sorrow walked beside them like a shadow that never left, and the galaxy still watched in silence. The races who had abandoned Earth whispering in private councils. Perhaps they had misjudged the humans. Perhaps this race was not weak, but their fear kept them frozen, unwilling to risk themselves, and so humanity paid the price alone. Captain Arden, in one of his final transmissions, spoke words that would echo across human history. If this is the cost of standing alone, then we will pay it, but we will make sure the galaxy remembers the debt. And soon after, his ship was destroyed in a blaze of fire that took 3 enemy cruisers with it, and his name became one of those whispered legends, another spark in the darkness. The pain of sacrifice weighed heavy on the people of Earth, but instead of breaking them, it carved them into something harder, sharper, unyielding. And in the silence between battles, one truth was clear. Humanity was bleeding, but they would not stop, because standing alone was no longer just a fate forced on them. It was a choice, a vow. And if they had to pay in blood to keep that vow, then so be it. For even in the ashes of their cities and the wreckage of their fleets, the whisper still carried through the void, "We stand alone." And though the price was unbearable, it became the proof that humanity's spirit was stronger than anyone had ever believed. The enemy had believed from the beginning that humanity would be crushed quickly, just another young race burned out by the fire of war. Yet as the battle stretched into weeks and then months, a strange unease began to spread through their ranks. For every time they struck, humanity struck back. Every time they killed, humanity rose again. And though the humans were bleeding more than any other, their spirit never seemed to fade. Instead, it grew brighter, sharper, louder, and soon even the enemy soldiers began to whisper that this war was different, that perhaps humanity could not be broken. And in that hesitation, the tide of war began to shift. Reports from the front reached the enemy high command describing human ships that refused to retreat even when surrounded, soldiers who fought with bare hands when their weapons ran out, civilians who rebuilt defenses in the middle of bombardments, and commanders who sacrificed themselves not to save victory, but to deny defeat. And these reports unsettled the enemy, because such resistance was not logical. It was not efficient. It was not how wars were supposed to be fought. Yet the humans embraced it fully, turning death into defiance, and every loss into a message. On Earth, the suffering continued, but the people stood taller than before. They knew the galaxy was watching, even if in silence. And so they lived as examples, refusing to show fear, refusing to collapse. And in that choice, they sent a silent message to every world that had abandoned them. You may leave us, you may betray us, but you cannot erase us. In the enemy war council's arguments broke out. Some commanders demanded more ships, more fire, more destruction, but others hesitated, asking why so much effort was needed for such a small race, why victories were so costly, and worst of all, why the humans seemed to grow stronger the more they suffered. And these questions spread like cracks in a wall, weakening the certainty that had once guided their invasion. Among the abandoned races of the galaxy, secret transmissions began to circulate, small recordings of human resistance, images of burning cities where people still stood unbroken, voices of children whispering we stand alone, even in shelters deep under the ground. And though the leaders of these races try to hide it, their people began to ask questions. Why had they left the humans to die? Why did humanity still fight when others would have surrendered long ago? And in those questions anew, fear arose. Fear not of humanity's death, but of their survival. For if the humans survived, they would never forget the betrayal. The enemy hesitated more with every passing day, their fleets no longer charging blindly into human defenses, their commanders no longer laughing at the thought of resistance. And in this hesitation, humanity found room to breathe, not victory yet, but space to prepare, to strike, to endure. In one battle over the ruins of Luna Station, the enemy hesitated to deliver the killing blow, unsure if it was another trap, and that moment of doubt gave the humans just enough time to counterattack, turning what should have been a crushing defeat into a costly stalemate. And from that day, the enemy's hesitation became their weakness, a weakness humanity exploited again and again. On Earth, the people began to notice it too. The enemy was slowing, doubting, second-guessing, and this knowledge gave them strength, for if the enemy could hesitate, then they could fear, and if they could fear, then they could be beaten. The galaxy, watching from the shadows, began to see it as well, and whispers turned to quiet respect. The humans had stood alone against the greatest threat the stars had ever seen, and now even the enemy was no longer sure of victory, and though no aid came yet, the silence was no longer one of dismissal but of awe, because humanity, the youngest race, the abandoned children of the galaxy, had forced the most feared empire into hesitation. And as humanity prepared for the next wave, they whispered again, louder than ever, not only to themselves but to the stars, we stand alone. And in that whisper the enemy heard something they had not expected to hear, the sound of fear in their own hearts. The moment of hesitation from the enemy gave humanity what they had never been granted before, a chance. And with that chance, they prepared something greater than any single raid or ambush. They prepared to strike so loud the entire galaxy would hear it. And so began the gathering of every ship, every weapon, every soldier left, a desperate gamble forged not from strength but from courage. Because humanity knew if they stayed on the defensive, they would slowly bleed to death. But if they roared, with all they had at once, perhaps they could push the enemy back. Perhaps they could prove once and for all that Earth would not be broken. And so in underground factories, workers built weapons from scraps. Scientists turned broken satellites into deadly traps. Engineers rebuilt ships that should have been left in ruins. And across the world, ordinary people gave everything they had. Farmers gave food, children carried supplies, and old men and women offered their wisdom and prayers, because this was no longer just a war for soldiers. This was a war for survival, and every human heart was now part of the fight. When the day came, the skies over Earth filled with the largest human fleet ever assembled, a patchwork of warships, freighters turned into gunboats, old vessels given new life. And though they looked fragile compared to the towering enemy armada, they carried something greater than steel. They carried defiance, and in every command room the same whisper moved like fire. Today we roar. The battle began with silence, the enemy advancing with their endless ships, confident that this desperate human fleet would crumble in minutes. But when the first human volley struck, the void exploded with fury, missiles tearing through enemy formations, hidden mines detonating among their lines, and human ships charging forward like wolves, striking with a madness that even the enemy could not understand. And soon the silence was gone, replaced by the roar of humanity, a roar of guns, a roar of voices, a roar of a species that had been left to die but refused to bow. On the ground, civilians joined in the fight, launching rockets from rooftops, sabotaging enemy landers, and turning every ruined street into a battlefield. And the enemy, expecting terror, found only rage, for every man, woman, and child of Earth now stood as a soldier in spirit, if not in weapon. And this collective defiance shook even the most hardened invaders. In orbit, Captain Hale's successors led daring charges, smashing enemy cruisers with ramming maneuvers, sacrificing themselves not with despair, but with purpose, and every sacrifice became a flame that lit the path for the next fighter. And across the galaxy, transmissions of the battle slipped through the silence, carried by secret sympathizers, spreading the vision of Earth's roar to every world. And those who had abandoned humanity watched in disbelief, because this was no longer the cry of a dying race. It was the birth of something far greater, the proof that humanity was not only surviving, but rising. The enemy, shaken, poured more ships into the battle, determined to crush this defiance. But the more they pressed, the more ferocious the humans became, fighting with a fury that ignored fear, fighting as if every death was simply a message. And for the first time in their history, the enemy began to retreat, not in full, but in steps, small, uncertain, because the roar of humanity was too loud to ignore, too dangerous to dismiss, and too costly to face head-on. On Earth, the people saw this retreat, and their hearts ignited with hope that had been lost for so long, and they roared louder, their voices carried in every broadcast, their defiance shaking the silence of the galaxy. And suddenly humanity was no longer whispering. They were shouting, "We stand alone, we fight alone, and still we fight." And the galaxy trembled because the roar of a people abandoned had become the roar of a legend being born. The great battle that became known as humanity's roar left the stars burning with wreckage. And when the smoke cleared, it was not Earth that lay broken, but the enemy, their fleets torn, their soldiers demoralized, their commanders shaken by the madness of a race that refused to die. And though the humans had suffered greatly, losing more lives than any world could count, they had done the impossible. They had forced the enemy to retreat. And in that retreat, a silence spread across the galaxy. The silence of disbelief, the silence of awe, because never before had any race stood alone against such power and survived. Yet humanity had not only survived, they had scarred the enemy. They had carved their defiance into the memory of every world watching. And now the same races that had abandoned them began to send secret envoys, timid voices asking for alliances, apologies, forgiveness. But humanity remembered the night of betrayal. Humanity remembered the silence when help was begged for. Humanity remembered the empty skies when their fleets had been left alone, and they answered not with anger, but with cold truth. We stood alone when it mattered. We do not need your pity now. Across Earth, the rebuilding began, cities rising from ashes, families mourning their dead but carrying pride in their hearts. Children growing with stories of defiance whispered like prayers, and in every corner of the world the same words were carved into stone, spoken in classrooms, written into history books. We stand alone, not as weakness but as strength, not as sorrow but as honor. And this became the legacy that bound them together. In the enemy councils, fear grew deeper, for they realized humanity was not just another opponent. Humanity was a symbol, and symbols could not be killed with fire. Symbols lived in memory, in whispers, in stories that spread faster than fleets. And soon even their own soldiers feared the humans, speaking of them as wolves in the dark, fighters who would never surrender. And the thought of facing them again planted doubt in every plan. The galaxy as a whole was forced to look at itself in shame, for they had abandoned the youngest race, expecting them to fall quietly, and instead they had watched that race rise higher than any had dared to dream. And though some races reached out with offers of friendship now, humanity did not forget. Their leaders spoke clearly. We will not kneel to those who left us in the fire. We will walk our own path. And if alliances come again, they will come on our terms, for we have already proven that even when left to die, we endure. Generations passed, and the scars of the war remained, but so too did the pride, and the whisper that had carried them through their darkest hours became more than a whisper. It became a creed, a way of life, a reminder that strength does not come from numbers or allies, but from the will to rise when all else has fallen. And so humanity marched into the future with heads unbowed, eyes fixed on the stars. No longer the forgotten children of the galaxy, but the people who had taught the galaxy a lesson it would never forget, that abandonment does not mean defeat, that betrayal does not mean surrender, that standing alone does not mean weakness, and as long as one human heart still beat, the roar of defiance would never end. And so the final message echoed across the stars, whispered first in the ruins, then shouted in the victories, then carved into the destiny of a species. The galaxy left them to die, but humanity whispered back, "We stand alone." And from that day, the universe trembled whenever those words were spoken.